Hey guys, welcome back to Eric's Hobby Workshop. Today I'm going to show you how I built this desert wasteland fort. This is the biggest project on the channel yet, and it's going to be a good one. Let's get to it. I begin this project by doing a quick sketch of the end result I want to achieve. This will give me some guidance later in the process, but is far from a formal blueprint that I will follow rigidly. What I do know for sure is that I want a craggy outcropping of desert stone with a cave/tunnel entrance cut in at ground level and a ramshackle outpost above. With this plan sketched out, I can begin building with a better idea of where I'm going. I start by blocking out the main rock mass by using some pink EPS foam. There's no need to be neat or precise here, so I use a big kitchen knife. Not gonna lie, it feels appropriate to be holding this big brutal choppa to make this orky fort. I cut the rough shape of the tunnel and rock around it, using this toy truck as a guide to make sure it's the right size. This truck will eventually be converted into an orky vehicle in the future, so it makes sense that I'll use it. I use a product called liquid nails to glue the layers of EPS together. This stuff is alright, I'm not sure I'd recommend it. Building with foam is easy because once you have your basic shape, you can just trace that shape onto another layer and add height easily. So I'm doing that here. I also decided to use this large gang box as part of the structure as well. As you can see, I'm using all sorts of rough offcuts of foam. It doesn't matter, it's all going to get covered up later. This is a good way to get rid of some scraps from previous projects. Once I have some nice dabs of liquid nails in between the foam, I use some cocktail skewers to reinforce the structure, stabbing down through the pieces of foam at various angles to prevent the layers from slipping and sliding on the glue as they dry. Once all my sticks are in, I trim the ends flush so I can put a stack of books on top. Next, I cut a base from a large piece of chipboard. At this stage I realized how large this thing is going to be. I'm not really sure where I'm going to store this thing, but that's a problem for future Eric. Anyways, once my base is cut out, I glue the piece down with liquid nails and hot glue. For the rock texture, I'm going to be using these bark chips that I came across when I was out for a walk. I cut them with my kitchen knife to get a nice clean edge, then glue them on the walls with hot glue, trying to interlock the shapes and get as natural a pattern as possible. I found these bark chips in massive quantity on the verge outside of an apartment building near my house. I don't advocate stealing crafting materials, so I asked the property manager if I could take some of them to use in my arts and crafts. The guy was fairly taken aback, and I had to explain what I wanted a few times before he understood, but once he did understand, he was happy to give them to me. He seemed oddly relieved, actually. I kind of wondered what he thought I was asking at first. He kind of had this look of, surprise and terror in his eyes that I was even asking him about them. I probably came off as a little bit crazy or something. But anyways, if you are on the lookout for crafting materials like me all the time, always ask before looting private property for bits and pieces. People are usually receptive to part with a few sticks and stones if you're nice about it, but don't just assume that they'll be okay with you helping yourself. These pieces of bark have a great layered look that'll hopefully look like sedimentary stone when we're done. I'm just kind of using my instincts and applying them wherever I think it'd be cool to have some exposed rock poking out. That nice piece over the doorway, for example, I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. In some places, I cut into the EPS foam in layers with horizontal cuts to try to get a similar effect. I also cut a sloping path into the stone at the back to make a little spot for a sally port. At this stage of the building process, you're just trying to make a rough block-in of the shapes, so it's okay to be improvisational and a little bit sloppy. Feel free to hack away, and this is where the fun stuff happens. You create little moments here and there of neat little areas that you might not have planned for. Using a few more scraps, I add some more height to the build, once again stabbing them through with skewers, after gluing them to keep them nice and secure. There's a lot of bark to go on this thing, and it was pretty time consuming, but it's very gratifying to see the texture come out so quickly. I really like this method. Let's talk for a minute about terrain philosophy. In my opinion, Good terrain not only has to look good as a whole, but also has to have a lot of mini compositions within it that work on their own. And what I mean by that is there have to be little areas that your models can stand at that look good when you're just focusing on an individual model. Improvisationally building really helps to create those things, because maybe you have a piece of something that looks good when you put it down, and it gives you an idea just kind of on the fly. What I'm saying is, give yourself the chance to improvise and to have some happy little accidents just come through from the materials themselves as you're building. That's usually where, for me, the most colorful and interesting parts of a model actually happen. In this case, it worked out to my benefit that I used scrap pieces of foam, because there's all sorts of weird little shapes and cracks already in the foam that I can work with to make natural looking rock forms. So it worked out quite nicely. You'll see as it takes shape. Next, I'm going to build a little turret. I start with a paper towel roll, cut part of it out, and place it where I want it. Using a ruler, a compass, and some chipboard, I cut a platform and catwalk for the turret. From there I reinforce it with little discs of EPS foam, so it has a little bit more strength to the structure. I cut out the catwalk and the platform, do a little test, looking good. I glue the turret on with some hot glue. I made this weird sub-assembly that allowed me to ensure I was gluing this paper towel roll directly into the center of the platform and allowed me to adjust the height before finally gluing it. Weird little problems and solutions like this are what scratch building is all about. I wanted to give the impression that this rock is honeycombed with tunnels and entrances. To do that, I carve a doorway on the back from an already existing crack, using a miniature to make sure the size is okay. It's fine if it's a little tight. If anything, that makes more sense. For the front side, I'm going to use an old plastic Necromunda bulkhead, since it has this great detail, a small ladder, and a perfect door. It's also an homage to the old gorkamorka scenery, which is a big influence for this build. I cut off the top, dig out a spot, and glue it in with hot glue. I'm going to place in some O-scale styrene stairs. These look awesome at warhammer scale, and also allow me to have multiple levels that are fairly flat and ideally suited for minis to stand on. I'm also going to add a catwalk made from the set of dollhouse construction toys called Ruminate. I've used these in a lot of my videos before. I found a big bag at the thrift store for cheap. They might not be the most affordable thing to craft with if you don't get them cheap. Anyways, I banged this on with some hot glue. Let's get started on the main gate. I started with a basic design made from sandwiches of chipboard. Measuring and cutting precise things out of chipboard like this always makes me think of Wyloch's Armory. Wyloch is one of the best terrain crafters on YouTube, so you should check him out if you haven't heard of him. I'll put a link in the bio. Then, using some pieces of plastic yard tools that look like I-beams, I block out a door frame. I've used these little yard tools in several of my other previous videos, but unfortunately the store I get them from stopped selling them, so this might be the last video they're in. Fingers crossed. With that done, I construct some hinges from pieces of styrene tube and a smaller gauge of styrene rods. The idea here is to insert the thin rod into one of the pieces of tube and glue it there, and then have the other piece of tube able to move around the outside as a hinge. I glue that on with some hot glue. I had never done this before, but I have to say, it worked really well. Sweet. Doing the hinges this way also meant that the doors are removable, so I can paint them and assemble them separately. I stand up the door frames on my base and glue them down with some hot glue. Then it's time to make some walls. I decided to use foam board for the walls, cutting all the panels to the same height but at various widths. I then used some scrap pieces to make a parapet at the same level as the gang boxes. I continued the foam board wall on both sides of the gate. When I got to the rock mass, I made a retaining wall out of chipboard. No need for parapets here, the garrison can just stand on the rock shelf behind. I also used some styrene I-beams for the back sally port and add some more stairs. I used some scraps of chipboard to fill in the walls wherever it needs it, on the gang box and anywhere else. I add another platform on the back of the fort to add some more levels and structure. For the supports, I use a few pieces of Hot Wheels car elevator picked up a few months ago. I built up some more rocks around the edges to tie the structure in with the rest. Using a strip of foam board, I add some ramparts. As usual, my little model friend oversees the construction to make sure everything's at the right scale. I keep moving around the structure, adding bark and stairs where appropriate. Here's where I turn my mind to gameplay, or at least thinking like a miniature, and how do I get up to this platform? How do I get here? I added a piece of HO scale railroad track to the bottom of the turret catwalk to add a bit of rigidity and detail. With that in place, I cut a little divot for the catwalk to sit flush, and I glued the piece in place. I added some extra pieces of plastic toy to make a more interesting shape. I then add a rampart by bending a piece of foam board and hot gluing it down. I decided to add another Necromunda bulkhead in the courtyard, only with the ladder on the right this time for some variation. Again, I keep moving around the structure, adding bark and stairs where appropriate, trying to make sure there are no awkward areas that look unfinished and that the whole thing has a nice flow to it. I deliberately didn't cover a few specific areas of foam with bark, and the reason for that is I wanted those parts to have a machine-tooled appearance, like they had been cut into the rock face to allow clearance for a pathway or something like that. For the platform above the bulkhead here, I used the piece of offcut train track from when I built the turret. Always keep your bits, always keep your offcuts. You never know when they're going to be perfect. I have to say there's something very satisfying about laying this bark down. It kind of feels like you're terraforming an alien world. Nice piece on top there, beautiful. Next, I start building some ramshackle structures and roof lines out of bits of chipboard and foam board. I'm looking for a scrappy, rough, improvised style of building here. In my mind, this fortress has been repaired and expanded with improvised materials from crashed ships, destroyed vehicles, or leftover junk metal over the years. Stylistically, I know I'm going to want a lot of slanted corrugated metal roofs. I've just always thought they look really cool. Using a piece of cocktail stick and some toys, I make a little aerial apparatus to go on the top. Next, I add some spackle to the cracks and transitions to fill gaps and to make a more natural looking transition between the bark and foam. I use an old paintbrush, my finger, and a cocktail stick to mimic the horizontal sediment layers I'm going for. The spackle goes on pink, but it actually dries white. Not that it matters, I mean the foam is pink, it's all going to be painted eventually. Just thought I'd mention that. This stuff is not the easiest to work with, it's very sticky. If you want it to stick a little bit less, you can wet your fingers. Wetting your fingers allows you to make a nice smooth texture, like I'm doing over here. But mostly you just have to play around with it to get the hang of it. It's also worth mentioning that it does contract when it dries a little bit, so it will warp the chipboard if you haven't already glued 100 pounds of bark to it. If you hear some sirens going by in the distance while I'm narrating, I apologize for that, but there's really not much I can do about it. They go by so often these days. I live in New York City, and if you follow the news at all, you know it's a little crazy here right now. But my wife and I are safe and healthy, thankfully, and I really appreciate everybody who's messaged me, reaching out to me to check on me. That means a lot. And I hope that all of you guys are doing well and taking care of yourselves in this time as well. One of the positives about being on lockdown is that I've had a little bit more time than normal to work on this massive fort. So, hopefully you guys like it. Time to add a bunch of scraps to really sell the rundown and improvised style of this fort. I was careful to cut fairly regular pieces. A lot of the time, orc forts in particular are covered in crooked triangular shapes, and sometimes it can look childish in my opinion. It reminds me a little bit sometimes of Looney Tunes cartoons where Wile E. Coyote gets the giant electromagnet and it just kind of pulls everything for a mile around up to him and makes a giant pile of scrap. Don't get me wrong, that can be really cool, but that's not what I'm going for with this build. I'm trying to find a middle ground here so that the space can conceivably be a human outpost as well as a Digga or orc fort. I start with chipboard, but use some foam sheets to make the curved pieces on the tower as well. I'll put links in the description for all the materials I used for this project. That's a good way to support the channel. Using those Amazon affiliate links gives me a little kickback, and you get the stuff you need. Next, I do a pass with some pieces of corrugated paper. As I was mentioning before, this corrugated metal look really brings home the scrappy, rusty shantytown look that I'm going for. It's also nice and flexible, which is handy. This is a really great time to use up some of the scraps that I've built up from other projects. Luckily, I have lots of scraps of this Plastruct diamond plating. This is a scale modeling material that I'll put a link for in the bio that adds a lot of detail and is really cool. Maybe this outpost once looked new and respectable, but after many battles, bullet holes, and las burns and things like that, it's now been patched up with all sorts of materials and has a ramshackle look. I also add a few plastic bits that were kicking around my bits box at this stage to add some variety. As weird as this is for me to say, my bits boxes are actually seeming to be running kind of low after all these builds I've been doing. I really haven't been able to go to a thrift store recently and restock them for obvious reasons. Next, I add a few ladders made from this plastic sports racket. These go anywhere that's not accessible by stairs. Using my bare hands like an absolute animal, I spread some spackle in the interior courtyard. I roll a wheel from a toy car held between my thumb and forefinger to put some wheel tracks in the wet spackle. I also made some wheel grooves with a cocktail stick just to reinforce the directionality of what I was going for, because the wheel was a little bit hard to grab onto. To add some more detail, I cut little slices off a styrene rod and superglued them to the edge of some panels to look like rivets. I was pretty sparing with this because, to be honest, I'm not sure how much I like the look of this rivets. Alright, the main structure of the build is done. I cannot wait to get some paint on this thing, tie all the colors together, and get this thing ready for the table. Anyways, time to start sealing the model. I use a mix of black acrylic paint and Mod Podge. I apply this mixture very generously to help it seep into the cracks, then use the brush to brush away the excess to make sure the details of the bark pieces are preserved. My intention is to paint the stone a deserty sandstone color, but this grey looks pretty good, and I'll have to keep that in mind for future projects, maybe in a more temperate climate. I apply some white glue and then sprinkle on some coarse sand to add some texture to the transitions, and then do another pass with fine sand. I got sand everywhere doing this. I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. Once the sand is down, I apply another layer of paint and Mod Podge to seal that in too. Alright, time to prime. I hauled this thing outside to apply some black spray paint. This is the moment when it truly dawned on me how large and heavy this thing is. I must have used 30 hot glue sticks putting the bark on, and you can tell. If you're wondering what black spray paint I used, it's a mix of Rust-Oleum Flat, Krylon Satin, and Krylon Texture. All 3 cans are almost out, and I used them interchangeably. It really doesn't matter that much. Anyways, once the black is dry, I used Liquitex Low Odor Burnt Umber and applied a nice coat of that. This is always one of my favorite stages of painting, is when all the multicolored pieces I built come together with the first base coat. I love it. I hauled this bad boy inside and started painting. First, I heavily overbrushed the rocks with raw sienna, leaving the burnt umber in only the deepest recesses. As I was doing this, I couldn't help but think the rocks were starting to look like chicken nuggets. I haven't been to McDonald's since the quarantine started, but that's probably for the best. It's nice to use a big brush with a long handle for something like this because there's some hard to reach spots. Don't worry too much about getting some paint on what's going to be the metal areas because it'll just look like rust later. Next, I hit all the metal areas with a heavy dry brush of cheap acrylic silver. This paint actually dries more transparent than it goes on as the medium turns from opaque to clear, so I apply it generously, but I do try not to get any on the rocks. I love this stage. It's amazing to see the colors start to pop out. It starts to look real. The vision is coming together. All the hard work is paid off. Next, I mix in some unbleached titanium paint with the raw sienna, and then I hit the rocks with the dry brush, focusing on the areas that would catch light. This really brings out the texture and adds a nice deserty dustiness. Sometimes the dusty look is the downside of dry brushing, but in this case it's perfect. So I really scrub the brush in to get that nice dry layered look. For the last step here, I'm going to hit the metal areas with a black wash made from black paint, black ink, water, and a drop of dish liquid. It goes on thick and slides around as it dries, so I'm mindful of making sure it doesn't pool in weird ways, and I stipple the paintbrush to avoid any obvious brush strokes. And let's call that done for today. that simple paint job has things looking really great. In another video, I'm going to come back and add some modular details. As I discussed previously, I want this fort to be versatile enough stylistically to be usable for many different forces. One idea I had was to make some orky pieces that clip on in various locations, such as over the gate, so when it's used as an orc fort, it has that extra orkiness to it. But it's still pretty good for orcs as is. As you may have noticed, I'm a big fan of very simple paint schemes when it comes to terrain. One of the reasons for this is that I want the models themselves to be the highlight. So let's get some models on here to see how they look. First up, these guys are my Diggas. Diggas are the human inhabitants of the orc planet of Gorkamorka. They worship orcs and orc technology, and they live underground. So this fort is perfect. So one thing I love to incorporate into my terrain is modularity, but here's something that I didn't plan for and probably could have never anticipated. If I take a GW Alchemite stack set, like this one here, you can put it here and here, and make it sort of more of a desert refinery type thing. And what really blows my mind is how well this fits in right on this top of this thing here. If I had tried to make it fit, it wouldn't have been this good. Like, this is like precision machined within a millimeter tolerance fit on this thing here, and I can't believe it. Sometimes things just work out. Sometimes you just get lucky. What can I say? I mean, you guys saw the video. I literally just took a piece of foam board and bent it and glued it down. And it happens to be the exact diameter of this Alchemite stack. This look would be perfect for a Necromunda Ash Wastes table. Orks in particular look really good on this piece. There's something about the way the green skin contrasts with the orange stone and the rusty metal. It just gives me those classic orc vibes. I want to take a moment to thank my Patreon supporters. Your guys' support means so much to me, so I really appreciate that. Thank you, Zux. Daniela Rotero. Wendy Francis. Midwinter Minis. Kim Harder Fog. Joel Mullins. And Cornelius Perkins. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your support. It means the world to me. I can't wait to try this piece out in a real battle. Obviously, I don't have any contact with the guys I usually game with right now, but I've been working on my wife, and if I can convince her to battle me, well, that will be a huge victory, and I might even make a battle report of it, put it on the channel. That could be really cool, so wish me luck. So, I hope you liked that video. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That would really be a big help and contribute to our ability to produce these videos. I say our, it's just me. It's Eric's Hobby Workshop, and it's just Eric. Yeah, but yeah. Hit me up in the links below, and thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.